Jake Morrison drove his old truck down the dusty road toward his new home. The year was 2157, and most people lived in big cities on Earth or worked on space stations far away. But Jake wanted quiet. He wanted peace. After 10 years fighting wars on distant planets as a space marine, he just wanted to study animals and be alone. The research station sat in a valley near the old Yellowstone area in Montana. Mountains rose up on all sides, covered with green trees and wild grass. Tall metal fence ran around the whole valley, keeping the wildlife safe from hunters and developers. Jake would live in a small house next to the fence and study the animals that lived inside the protected area. His new boss, Dr. Corinne White, had warned him about strange things happening lately. "We've been getting weird reports," she told him. Over the video call, people see big shapes flying overhead. Heat sensors pick up massive signatures. Some ranchers lost cattle, but we never find any bodies or blood. Jake unpacked his truck and looked around. The house was simple but clean. Solar panels on the roof powered everything. A computer system connected him to the research network. Large windows faced the valley so he could watch the animals. Everything seemed normal and peaceful. On his first night, Jake sat on his porch drinking coffee and watching the sunset. The valley was beautiful. Deer walked through the grass. Birds flew between the trees. He saw a family of bears playing near a stream. This was exactly what he needed after years of war and violence, but something felt different. Jake had spent too many years in dangerous places to ignore his instincts. The animals seemed nervous. They kept looking up at the sky and running to hide under trees. Even the bears looked worried, which was strange because bears were not afraid of anything. His second day started early. Jake put on his research gear and walked along the fence line, taking notes about animal behavior. He carried a camera, a tablet computer, and sensors to measure heat and movement. The fence was strong and tall, made of metal posts and thick wire. Signs warned people to stay out of the protected area. Around noon, Jake stopped for lunch near a section of fence that seemed newer than the rest. The metal posts were bigger here, and the wire was thicker. Someone had recently made this part of the fence much stronger. Why would they need to do that? As he ate his sandwich, Jake heard a sound from the sky. It was like wind, but stronger and more regular, like giant wings beating slowly. He looked up, but saw nothing except blue sky and white clouds. The sound came again, closer this time. All the animals in the valley ran for cover. Jake grabbed his binoculars and scanned the sky. Nothing, but the sound continued, moving across the valley from east to west. Whatever was making that noise was big and flying just above the treetops. Jake made notes on his tablet and checked his sensors, but they showed nothing unusual. That evening, Jake called Dr. White to report what he heard. "The animals are definitely scared of something," he told her. "And I heard something flying, but I couldn't see it." "Maybe it's military aircraft," she suggested. "They sometimes test new planes in remote areas." But Jake had heard every kind of aircraft during his military service. This was different. This was something alive. His third day changed everything. Jake woke up early and made coffee while the sun came up over the mountains. He stepped onto his porch and nearly dropped his mug. 3 enormous shapes sat in the valley beyond the fence, about half a mile away. They were dragons. Real dragons, like from old stories, but bigger than Jake had ever imagined. Each one was as long as a passenger airplane. Their scales caught the morning light and sparkled with colors that seemed to shift and change. One was golden, one was deep blue, and one was silver white. They had huge wings folded against their backs and long necks that moved like snakes. Jake stood perfectly still, afraid to move or make any sound. The dragons were clearly not from Earth. Their scales had a strange shimmer that looked almost like metal. Their eyes were large and bright, filled with intelligence that seemed old and wise. These were not simple animals. These were thinking beings. The golden dragon, the largest of the three, turned its massive head toward Jake's house. Their eyes met across the distance. Jake felt his heart beating fast, but not from fear. The dragon's gaze was curious, not threatening. It studied Jake the same way Jake studied animals for his research. For several minutes, human and dragon looked at each other. Then the golden dragon made a low rumbling sound, like distant thunder. The other two dragons moved closer to their leader. All three watched Jake with the same curious, intelligent expression. Jake slowly reached for his camera, moving carefully so he would not startle the creatures. But as soon as he lifted the camera, all three dragons spread their wings and flew, away with powerful beats that shook the ground. They disappeared over the mountains so quickly that Jake wondered if he had dreamed the whole thing. But the grass where they had been sitting was flattened into 3 large circles. The heat from their bodies had left warm spots that Jake could feel even from his side of the fence. This was real. Jake spent the rest of the day taking pictures of the flattened grass and measuring the heat signatures. He collected soil samples and noted everything in his research journal. The dragons had been there, but they left no damage. The grass was pressed down, but not burned or torn. They had been careful not to hurt anything. That afternoon, Jake called the local sheriff's office to report what he had seen. Deputy Tom Harris laughed. Dragons? Come on, Jake. You've been alone out there too long. Maybe you saw some big birds. Tom, I know what I saw. These things were bigger than trucks. They had intelligence in their eyes. Look, we've had reports of missing cattle, but no one's seen any dragons. Maybe you should come to town for a few days. Get around some people. Jake knew no one would believe him without proof. He needed better pictures. He needed evidence. But more than that, he needed to understand what these creatures wanted. If they were dangerous, people needed to know. If they were not dangerous, people needed to know that the next morning. Jake woke up before sunrise and positioned himself near the fence with his best camera and recording equipment. He waited as the sun came up, watching the valley carefully. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the 3 dragons returned. They landed in the same area as before, but this time they did something different. They moved closer to the fence, stopping about 100 yards away. The golden dragon sat down and folded its wings, looking directly at Jake. The other 2 arranged themselves on either side of their leader. Jake realized they were waiting for something. But what? They could easily fly over the fence if they wanted to. They could probably break through the metal posts without much effort. But they stayed on their side, watching him with patient, intelligent eyes. The dragons had come back at the same time Jake started his daily work. They were not hunting or exploring. They were waiting for him. But why would creatures with such obvious power wait for anything? Why would beings who could fly anywhere and do anything choose to sit by a fence and watch a human scientist? Jake picked up his notebook and started writing. Day 3, he wrote, "The dragons have returned. They seem to be waiting for me." Jake spent the next week watching the dragons every morning. They came at exactly 8 o'clock, just like clockwork. The golden dragon always sat in the middle, with the blue and silver dragons on each side. They would stay for about 2 hours, watching Jake work along the fence line, then fly away over the mountains. Jake started calling the golden dragon Apollo because of its bright, sun-like scales. The blue one became Neptune for its deep ocean color. The silver one he named Luna because it shimmered like moonlight. He knew giving them names was probably silly, but it helped him think of them as individuals instead of just dangerous monsters. Each day, Jake moved a little closer to the fence. The dragons watched but never moved away. Apollo would tilt his massive head, following Jake's movements with those bright, intelligent eyes. Sometimes the dragon would make soft rumbling sounds, almost like a cat purring, but much deeper. And more powerful. Jake noticed that the dragons had patterns in their behavior. Apollo always landed first and called to the others with a specific sound. They arranged themselves in the same positions every time. When Jake worked on the north side of the fence, they moved to face north. When he walked to the south, they shifted to watch him there too. On the 7th day, something amazing happened. Jake was measuring soil samples near the fence when he heard a different sound from the dragons. Not the usual rumbling, but something that almost sounded like counting. He looked up and saw Apollo touching rocks with his huge claws. 1 rock, then 2 rocks, and 3 rocks. Jake counted out loud. 1, 2, 3. Apollo's head snapped up at the sound of Jake's voice. The dragon made the rumbling sound again and touched 4 rocks, then 5. Jake's heart started beating fast. He set down his equipment and held up 1 finger. 1, he said clearly. Apollo rumbled and touched 1 rock. Jake held up 2 fingers. 2. Apollo touched 2 rocks. They continued this game up to 10, with Apollo correctly matching Jake's numbers every time. The other dragons watched this exchange with what looked like excitement. Neptune made happy chirping sounds, and Luna's scales seemed to glow brighter. Jake realized he was not just watching animals. He was communicating with intelligent beings. That afternoon, Jake called Dr. White with his report. Karen, these dragons are smart, really smart. They understand numbers. They're trying to communicate with me. Jake, that's impossible. Even if there really are large animals out there, intelligence like that would be ... I have video, Jake interrupted. I recorded everything. You need to see this. Dr. White was quiet for a long moment. Send me the files. I'll review them tonight and call you tomorrow. Jake uploaded hours of video showing the dragons' behavior patterns, their number games, and their careful observation of his daily routine. He also included thermal readings that showed the dragon's body heat was much higher than normal Earth animals, and audio recordings of their various sounds. The next morning, Dr. White called back. Her voice was different, more serious. Jake, I've sent your files to some experts. We need more data. Keep recording everything, but be very careful. Don't get too close to the fence. They're not dangerous, Karen. If they wanted to hurt me, they could have done it already. They could fly over this fence easily. That's what worries me. Why don't they? Jake had been wondering the same thing. The fence was tall, but not too tall for creatures that could fly. The metal posts were strong, but probably not strong enough to stop beings that size if they really wanted to get through. Why did the dragons stay on their side? That morning, Jake decided to test something. Instead of starting his work at 8 o'clock, he started at 7. The dragons were not there. At exactly 8 o'clock, they arrived and seemed confused when they could not find Jake in his usual spot. Apollo made concerned rumbling sounds and stretched his long neck to look around. Jake stepped out from behind a tree, and all 3 dragons immediately focused on him. Apollo made a happy sound, almost like relief. They had been worried about him. These creatures actually cared about his daily routine. Over the next few days, Jake tested different things. When he wore his red jacket instead of his usual blue, 1, the dragons noticed and made questioning sounds until he showed them it was still him. When he brought different equipment, they watched carefully to see what he was doing. When he sat down instead of walking around, they sat down too. Dragons were not just intelligent. They were social. They wanted to interact with him. Jake started bringing a bag of small rocks with him each morning. He would arrange them in patterns near the fence, straight lines, circles, triangles. The dragons would watch, then arrange their own rocks in the same patterns on their side. Apollo was the best at this game, but Neptune and Luna were learning too. One morning, Jake arranged 5 rocks in a row. Apollo copied the pattern perfectly. Then Jake moved 1 rock to make a different shape. Apollo rumbled thoughtfully, then moved one of his rocks to match Jake's new pattern exactly. They were having a conversation using rocks instead of words. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm. Jake was inside his house, watching the rain through his windows. Lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder shook the building. Through the storm, he saw the dragons in the valley, but they were not hiding from the rain like normal animals would. They were helping other animals. Jake grabbed his binoculars and watched in amazement. A group of deer had been caught in the open when the storm started. A flash flood from the mountain was rushing toward them. The deer were trapped between the rising water and steep rocks. Apollo spread his wings wide and breathed out a stream of controlled fire, not to hurt anything, but to create a wall of heat that stopped the flood water. Neptune and Luna used their bodies to guide the deer to safety on higher ground. The dragons worked together like a rescue team, using their power carefully to save lives instead of taking them. When the storm passed, Jake saw that the dragons had saved not just the deer, but also a family of bears, some wild horses, and dozens of smaller animals. The valley was full of creatures that should have been swept away by the flood, all safe because 3 dragons had chosen to help instead of just watching. Jake realized something important. These dragons were not predators looking for food. They were not invaders trying to take over territory. They were guardians. They were protecting the valley and everything in it. That evening, Jake made a decision. The next morning, he would try to get closer to the fence. If the dragons really were peaceful, if they really wanted to communicate, then maybe it was time to take the next step. He spent hours preparing. He gathered smooth stones of different colors and sizes. He practiced, arranging them in mathematical patterns, sequences that would be the same in any language. If the dragons were truly intelligent, they would recognize the universal truth of mathematics. Jake also wrote a long report for Dr. White, explaining everything he had observed. The dragons showed complex social behavior. They demonstrated problem-solving skills. They used tools to communicate. Most importantly, they showed compassion for other living things. As he wrote his report, Jake kept thinking about the fence. The dragons could cross it any time they wanted. They had the power to take whatever they needed from the human world. But they chose to wait. They chose to stay on their side and try to earn trust instead. Tomorrow, Jake would find out what they were really waiting for. The next morning, Jake woke up before sunrise. He had barely slept, thinking about what he was going to try. In his backpack, he carried colored stones arranged in special mathematical patterns that any intelligent being should recognize. He also brought his best camera and recording equipment. At exactly 8 o'clock, the 3 dragons arrived as always. Apollo landed first, followed by Neptune and Luna. They took their usual positions and looked toward Jake's house, waiting to see him start his daily work. Jake stepped out of his house and walked slowly toward the fence. He had never been this close before. When he was about 20 feet from the metal posts, he stopped and sat down on the ground. He wanted to show the dragons that he was not trying to threaten them or invade their space. Apollo's massive head turned toward Jake. The dragon's golden eyes were bigger than dinner plates, and Jake could see intelligence in them that seemed almost human. Apollo made a soft rumbling sound, then slowly stood up and walked closer to the fence on his side. Jake's hands shook a little as he opened his backpack. He pulled out a white stone and placed it on the ground, then a red stone next to it, then 2 white stones, then 3 red stones. This was the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical pattern found everywhere in nature. Apollo watched carefully. The dragon's long neck stretched forward as he studied Jake's arrangement. Then Apollo reached out with one huge claw and began arranging his own stones. 1 stone, 1 stone, 2 stones, 3 stones, 5 stones, 8 stones. Apollo was continuing the Fibonacci sequence perfectly. Jake felt his heart racing with excitement. This was real communication. Apollo understood mathematical concepts that even some humans found difficult. Jake added the next numbers in the sequence with his stones. Apollo matched them exactly. For the next hour, Jake and Apollo played with different mathematical patterns, prime numbers, geometric sequences, even simple addition and subtraction. Apollo learned each pattern quickly and could continue them on his own. Neptune and Luna watched from nearby, making soft, encouraging sounds. Then something unexpected happened. Apollo began creating his own pattern with stones. It was more complex than anything Jake had shown him. Jake studied it carefully, trying to understand what the dragon was communicating. Suddenly, Jake realized what he was looking at. It was a star map. Apollo had arranged stones to show the positions of stars and planets, but not the stars visible from Earth. This was a map of a different solar system, with different constellations and a different sun. Jake pointed to the star map and then pointed up at the sky. Apollo nodded his massive head and made a long, sad sound. Neptune and Luna moved closer to their leader, making comforting rumbles. Jake understood. The dragons were not from Earth. They had come from somewhere else, somewhere far away among the stars. The sadness in Apollo's voice suggested they could not go back home. Jake wanted to know more. He arranged stones to show Earth's solar system, with the sun in the center and planets arranged around it. He pointed to the 3rd stone from the center and then to the ground beneath his feet. "This is where we are now," he was trying to say. Apollo studied Jake's star map, then carefully rearranged some stones. He was showing the path his people had taken to reach Earth. It was a long journey across many star systems. At the end of the path, Apollo placed a single stone next to Jake's representation of Earth. 1 ship, 3 survivors. That was all that remained of an entire civilization. Jake felt tears in his eyes. These magnificent beings were refugees. They had lost their home, their families, their entire world. They had traveled across the vast emptiness of space to find safety, and they had chosen Earth. But why did they stay on their side of the fence? Why did they not just take what they needed? Jake picked up a stick and drew a line in the dirt between himself and the fence. Then he pointed to himself and stayed on his side of the line. He was trying to ask about boundaries and respect. Apollo understood immediately. The dragon picked up a large stone and placed it right at the fence line. Then he moved back several steps and sat down. He made a gesture with his claw that seemed to mean waiting or asking permission. Jake suddenly understood something amazing. In the dragon's culture, crossing boundaries without permission was wrong. Even though they had the power to take whatever they wanted, even though they were bigger and stronger than humans, they chose to wait for an invitation. They were showing respect. Jake stood up and walked to the fence. He placed his hand on the metal wire and looked directly at Apollo. "You want permission to cross," he said out loud, even though he knew the dragon could not understand his words. Apollo nodded his head and made a hopeful sound. Jake had no authority to give such permission. He was just a researcher studying animals. But he understood that this moment was important. These beings had waited patiently for weeks, showing their peaceful intentions, proving their intelligence, demonstrating their care for other living Things. Jake stepped back from the fence and made a welcoming gesture with his arms. Apollo's eyes grew bright with what looked like joy. But the dragon did not move forward. Instead, he turned to Neptune and Luna and made several different sounds. The three dragons seemed to be having a discussion. After a few minutes, Apollo turned back to Jake and began creating a new pattern with stones. This one was different from the mathematical sequences they had been playing with. It showed pictures instead of numbers. Jake saw images of dragons working alongside other beings. Not humans, but different alien species. The dragons were building things, healing damaged land, teaching young creatures to fly. These were not conquerors or destroyers. These were builders and healers. Apollo added more stone pictures showing forests growing healthy and strong, rivers running clean, and various species of animals living together in peace. The dragons were showing Jake what they could offer in exchange for a home on Earth. And Apollo created one more picture. It showed dragons and humans working together, with the fence removed in both species, sharing the valley peacefully. But next to this hopeful image, Apollo placed a single black stone. There was danger coming, something that threatened both dragons and humans. Jake leaned forward, trying to understand what the black stone meant. Apollo made urgent sounds and pointed toward the sky. Then he arranged stones to show many ships approaching Earth, but these ships were different from the peaceful dragon vessel. Other beings were coming to Earth, and they were not refugees seeking sanctuary. They were something else, something that made even the powerful dragons afraid. Jake realized why the dragons had really been waiting. They were not just asking for permission to cross the fence. They were trying to warn humanity about a greater threat. They wanted to become allies, to share their knowledge and power to protect Earth from whatever was coming. Apollo looked directly into Jake's eyes and made a sound that was clearly a question. The dragon was asking if humans would accept their help. Would Earth welcome 3 refugee dragons as protectors and partners? Jake knew he could not make this decision alone. This was too big, too important. But he also knew that time might be running out. If other hostile aliens were really coming to Earth, humanity would need all the help they could get. Jake pulled out his satellite phone and called Dr. White. His hands were shaking as he dialed. "Karen, I need you to come here immediately. Bring whoever you need to bring. Government officials, military leaders, scientists, everyone. Jake, what's happening? The dragons are trying to warn us about something. There's danger coming from space, and they want to help us. But we need to make a decision quickly." Jake looked at Apollo, who was watching the phone call with intelligent attention. "Karen, I think these dragons might be the best friends humanity has ever had. But we need to decide if we're going to trust them before it's too late." 2 days later, Jake heard helicopters approaching from the east. He counted 6 military aircraft flying in formation toward his research station. Dr. White had kept her promise and brought help. But Jake worried about what kind of help she had chosen to bring. The helicopters landed in a field near Jake's house, kicking up clouds of dust and making terrible noise. Soldiers in combat gear jumped out and immediately began setting up equipment. Jake saw weapons, sensors, and communication devices. This looked more like an invasion force than a scientific expedition. Dr. White climbed out of the lead helicopter, followed by a stern-looking woman in a military uniform. The woman had short gray hair and cold blue eyes that reminded Jake of winter ice. She walked with the confident stride of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "Jake Morrison," Dr. White called out. "This is Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Earth Defense Division. She's here to assess the situation." Colonel Hayes looked around the valley with sharp, calculating eyes. "Dr. Morrison, show me these alleged alien creatures." My orders are to determine if they pose a threat to Earth's security. Jake felt his stomach tighten with worry. Colonel, they're not threats. They're refugees. They want to help us. That's what we're here to determine, Hayes replied coldly. Where are they? Jake looked at his watch. It was almost 8 o'clock. They should arrive any minute. But Colonel, please understand, these beings are peaceful. They've had many chances to hurt me, but they've never even tried. Colonel Hayes signaled to her soldiers, who immediately spread out around the area with their weapons ready. We'll be the judge of their intentions, Dr. Morrison. At exactly 8 o'clock, the 3 dragons appeared over the mountains. But this time, they did not land immediately. Apollo, Neptune, and Luna circled high above the valley, clearly sensing that something was different. They could see the soldiers and weapons below. My God, Dr. White whispered. Jake, they're enormous. Colonel Hayes spoke into her radio. Command. This is Hayes. The targets are confirmed. 3 large aerial entities, approximately aircraft-sized, requesting permission to engage if necessary. No, Jake shouted. Colonel, they're trying to help us. If you attack them, you'll be starting a war with beings who only want peace. The dragons finally landed, but much farther from the fence than usual. Apollo made worried rumbling sounds as he studied the soldiers and their weapons. Neptune and Luna moved protectively on either side of their leader. Soldiers, take defensive positions, Colonel Hayes ordered. Dr. Morrison, approach the fence and attempt communication. We need to determine their capabilities and intentions. Jake walked slowly toward the fence, his heart pounding. He could see that Apollo was nervous and confused. The dragon had expected to continue their peaceful communication, not to face armed soldiers. It's okay, Apollo, Jake said softly, even though he knew the dragon could not understand his words. I'm trying to help. Jake sat down and pulled out his stones. He arranged them in the same friendship patterns he and Apollo had developed over the past weeks. Apollo looked at the stones, then at the soldiers, then back at Jake. The dragon seemed to be asking what was happening. Jake arranged stones to show the dragon and himself on one side and many humans on the other side. He was trying to explain that more people had come to meet the dragons. Apollo nodded and began arranging his own stones. But before Apollo could finish his pattern, Colonel Hayes spoke into her radio again. Command, the entity is manipulating objects. This could be preparation for an attack. Request immediate authorization for preemptive strike. Colonel, stop. Jake jumped to his feet. He's trying to communicate, not attack. Apollo heard the anger in Jake's voice and stood up quickly. The dragon's sudden movement caused all the soldiers to raise their weapons. Neptune and Luna spread their wings defensively, ready to protect their leader. Stand down, Colonel Hayes shouted to her soldiers. Then she spoke into her radio. Targets are now in aggressive posture, requesting immediate strike authorization. Jake realized the situation was about to spiral out of control. The soldiers were afraid, the dragons were confused, and Colonel Hayes was looking for any excuse to start shooting. Apollo, Jake called out. Show them what you showed me. Show them the star map. Show them the warning. Apollo understood Jake's urgent tone. The dragon quickly began arranging stones in the complex pattern that showed their journey from the stars and the approaching danger. But to the soldiers, it just looked like the creature was preparing some kind of weapon or trap. That's it, Colonel Hayes said. Fire warning shots over their heads. The soldiers opened fire into the air above the dragons. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley like thunder. Apollo roared in surprise and alarm, and Neptune and Luna roared back. The noise was so loud that Jake had to cover his ears, but the dragons did not attack. Instead, Apollo spread his massive wings and created a shimmering barrier of energy around all three dragons. The barrier was like a dome of golden light that surrounded them completely. "What is that?" Dr. White asked in amazement. "Defensive shielding," Colonel Hayes replied grimly. "Highly advanced technology. This confirms they're a threat to Earth's security." Jake watched in horror as Colonel Hayes spoke into her radio. "Command, targets have deployed energy weapons. Requesting full authorization for lethal force." "Colonel, you're making a terrible mistake," Jake pleaded. "They're defending themselves because you're shooting at them. They're not attacking anyone." The dragon's energy shield pulsed with beautiful colors. Jake could see Apollo through the barrier, still trying to arrange stones in patterns. Even while being shot at, the dragon was trying to communicate and warn humanity about the real danger coming from Space Dot. Then Jake heard a sound that chilled him to the bone. Colonel Hayes received authorization for a full attack. "All units, open fire. Target the largest entity first." Heavy weapons fire erupted from all around the valley. Explosive shells and energy beams struck the dragon's protective barrier, causing bright flashes of light. But the shield held strong, absorbing every attack without allowing any damage to reach the dragon's inside. Jake ran toward Colonel Hayes. "Stop this. You're attacking beings who want to help us." "Stand back, Dr. Morrison, or you'll be placed under arrest." Apollo's voice rose above the sound of weapons fire. The dragon was making loud, urgent sounds that carried across the entire valley. Jake realized Apollo was trying to warn them about something. Suddenly, the sky above them darkened. Shadows moved across the sun as massive shapes appeared in the atmosphere. These were not dragons. These were mechanical ships, angular and ugly, bristling with weapons. "Colonel," one of her soldiers called out, "we're reading multiple large contacts entering Earth's atmosphere. Unknown vessels, heavily armed." Colonel Hayes looked up at the alien ships with growing alarm. "How many?" 12 confirmed, Colonel. More appearing every minute." Jake looked at Apollo, who was still surrounded by the protective barrier. The dragon was pointing at the alien ships with one massive claw, then at his stone warnings on the ground. Apollo had been trying to warn them about this exact moment. The real enemy had arrived, while humanity was shooting at their only allies. "Colonel," Jake said urgently, "those ships up there are what Apollo was trying to warn us about. The dragons aren't our enemies. They're our only hope of surviving what's coming." Colonel Hayes stared at the alien ships filling the sky. Her soldiers' weapons seemed tiny and useless compared to the massive vessels overhead. Jake made a desperate decision. He ran toward the fence, climbed over it, and walked directly toward Apollo's energy barrier. "Jake, no!" Dr. White screamed. But as Jake approached, Apollo lowered the barrier. The dragon looked down at Jake with those intelligent golden eyes. And Jake saw something that gave him hope. Apollo was not angry about the attack. The dragon understood that humans were afraid and confused. Jake placed his hand on Apollo's massive claw. "Help us," he said simply. "Please help us fight them." Apollo nodded and let out a roar that shook the ground. Neptune and Luna answered with their own powerful calls. High above, the alien ships began descending toward Earth, their weapons charging. With deadly energy dot, the real battle was about to begin. Apollo looked up at the alien ships filling the sky, then down at Jake standing beside him. The dragon's golden eyes showed determination, mixed with sadness. Apollo had seen this enemy before. His people had fought them and lost everything. Jake turned to Colonel Hayes, who was staring in shock at the massive alien vessels. "Colonel, order your soldiers to stop shooting at the dragons. We need their help now." Colonel Hayes hesitated for a moment, then spoke into her radio. "All units, cease fire on the ground targets. Focus on the aerial threats. The alien ships were huge, each one the size of a city block. They moved slowly through the sky, their dark metal hulls gleaming with weapon lords and strange symbols. Jake counted at least 20 ships now, with more appearing every minute. Apollo made urgent sounds to Neptune and Luna. The three dragons spread their wings and prepared for battle. But first, Apollo turned to Jake and made a complex series of gestures with his claws. Jake watched carefully, trying to understand. Apollo pointed to the ground, then to Jake, then made a protective gesture around the human soldiers. The dragon was telling Jake to keep the humans safe while the dragons fought in the sky. Apollo wants us to stay on the ground, Jake called to Colonel Hayes. He's going to protect us while they fight the alien ships. The first alien ship opened fire, sending beams of red energy toward the research station. Apollo roared and shot into the sky, creating a golden energy shield above the humans. The alien weapons struck the shield and bounced harmlessly away. Neptune and Luna followed their leader into the air. The three dragons moved faster than any aircraft Jake had ever seen. They flew between the alien ships like arrows, dodging weapon fire and striking back with controlled bursts of flame and energy. Colonel Hayes watched in amazement as the dragons fought to protect Earth. Dr. Morrison, can you communicate with them? Can you coordinate our attacks? Jake looked up at Apollo, who was locked in battle with two alien ships at once. I don't think they need our help with the fighting, Colonel. But maybe we can help in other ways. Jake ran back to the fence and grabbed his stones. He arranged them quickly to show the pattern Apollo had taught him for danger and many enemies. Then he added stones to show human soldiers and dragons working together. Apollo saw Jake's message even while fighting. The dragon called out to his companions, and suddenly the three dragons changed their battle strategy. Instead of fighting alone, they began herding the alien ships toward areas where human weapons could be most effective. All units target the ships when the dragons drive them low, Colonel Hayes ordered. But do not fire when the dragons are close. The battle became a deadly dance between dragons and aliens above the Montana Valley. Apollo would attract enemy fire, then dive low over the human soldiers. As the alien ships followed him down, human missiles and energy weapons would strike them from below. Neptune used a different strategy. The blue dragon would fly directly at enemy ships, then create ice storms around them. The sudden cold would freeze their weapon systems, making them easy targets for Luna's precise fire attacks. Jake watched the battle with growing hope. The dragons and humans were learning to fight together. They were winning, but then something terrible happened. One of the largest alien ships, bigger than all the others, appeared through the clouds. This ship was different. Its hull was covered with spikes, and dark energy flowed around it like living shadows. Apollo saw the ship and let out a roar of pure rage. Jake had never heard such anger and pain in the dragon's voice. This was the ship that had destroyed Apollo's home world. The dark ship fired a massive energy beam directly at Apollo. The dragon tried to dodge, but the beam was too fast and too wide. It struck Apollo in the chest, sending him tumbling toward the ground. Apollo! Jake screamed. The golden dragon crashed. Near the fence, his body smoking from the alien weapon. Neptune and Luna immediately flew to their leader's side, creating protective barriers around him. But Jake could see that Apollo was badly hurt. Colonel Hayes spoke urgently into her radio. All units, focus fire on the large enemy vessel. That thing just took down our best ally. Human weapons fired at the dark ship, but their attacks seemed to have no effect. The ship's armor absorbed every missile and energy beam without damage. Worse, the ship was charging an even larger weapon, aimed directly at the research station. Jake ran to Apollo's side. The dragon was conscious, but weak. His golden scales were blackened, and his breathing was labored. Apollo looked at Jake with eyes full of regret, as if apologizing for failing to protect the humans. "It's okay, Apollo," Jake said, placing his hand on the dragon's massive head. "You did your best. You saved us." Apollo made a soft sound and gestured weakly toward the dark ship. Jake understood. The dragon was trying to tell him something important about their enemy. Jake looked more carefully at the alien vessel. It was charging its main weapon, but the process was taking time. Energy was building up in a large cannon on the ship's front. If that weapon fired, it would destroy everything in the valley. Suddenly, Jake realized what Apollo was trying to tell him. The ship's weapon was powerful, but it had a weakness. While charging, it could not move or defend itself properly. Jake ran to Colonel Hayes. "Colonel, that ship can't dodge while it's charging its big gun. If we hit it now, with everything we have, we might be able to stop it." Colonel Hayes looked at the dark ship, then at her weapons readings. "Dr. Morrison, our missiles aren't strong enough to penetrate that armor." Jake looked back at Apollo, who was struggling to stand up. Despite his injuries, the dragon was trying to get back into the fight. Neptune and Luna were supporting him, helping him rise. Then Jake had an idea. "Colonel, what if we combine our attacks? What if the dragons focus all their energy into making our weapons stronger?" Jake ran back to Apollo and quickly arranged stones to show dragons and humans attacking together, all focusing on the dark ship at the same moment. Apollo understood immediately. The dragon called to Neptune and Luna with urgent sounds. All three dragons nodded and prepared for one final attack. Apollo, despite his injuries, rose into the air supported by his companions. The three dragons flew in formation toward the dark ship, building energy as they moved. But instead of attacking the ship directly, they created a tunnel of pure energy that surrounded the human missiles. "Fire everything," Colonel Hayes ordered. Every human weapon fired at once. Missiles, energy beams, and projectiles streaked through the dragon's energy tunnel. The dragon's power amplified every attack, making them hundreds of times stronger than normal. The combined assault struck the dark ship just as its main weapon finished charging. The alien vessel's armor, which had seemed impossible to damage, cracked and shattered under the coordinated attack. The dark ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light that lit up the entire sky. The explosion was so bright that everyone on the ground had to cover their eyes. When the light faded, the dark ship was gone. The other alien vessels, seeing their flagship destroyed, began retreating into space. Within minutes, the sky was clear, except for the three dragons flying in victorious circles. Apollo landed near Jake, looking tired but happy. The dragon's injuries were already healing, his golden scales beginning to shine again. Neptune and Luna landed beside their leader, making joyful sounds. Colonel Hayes approached slowly, her weapon lowered. "Dr. Morrison, I owe you and your friends an apology. If we hadn't worked together, Earth would have been destroyed." Jake smiled and placed his hand on Apollo's claw. "Colonel, I don't think they're just my friends anymore. I think they're Earth's friends now." 6 months later, the valley looked very different. The fence was still there, but now it had gates that stayed open all day. Human scientists worked alongside the dragons, learning about advanced technology and environmental healing. Apollo had taught humanity how to clean polluted oceans and restore damaged forests. Neptune shared knowledge about sustainable energy that made space travel faster and cleaner. Luna helped develop new medical techniques that could heal injuries that were once impossible to treat. But most importantly, the dragons had taught humanity a new way to think about strength. True power was not about conquering or destroying. True power was about protecting and healing. Jake still made his morning rounds at 8 o'clock, but now Apollo often walked beside him. The dragon had become not just Earth's protector, but but Jake's closest friend. Sometimes Jake would look up at the stars and wonder if other refugee species might find their way to Earth. When they did, they would find a planet that had learned. An important lesson from 3 dragons who chose to wait patiently by a fence instead of taking what they wanted by force. The dragons had stepped over the fence, but they had waited for an invitation. And in doing so, they had saved not just themselves, but all of humanity.